Hello and welcome to Brain on Fire, Mold, Mycotoxins, and the Neuroimmune Interface. My name is Adair Anderson. I am the product marketing educator here at Vibrant and just wanted to go over some quick housekeeping items before we get started. All attendees are in listen-only mode. If you have questions during the presentation, please submit them as a comment. We will have time at the end for Q&A. And yes, this webinar is being recorded, and you will get a copy of the recording and the slides after the webinar ends. And now I'm pleased to introduce you to Brendan Vermiere. Brendan is a mental and metabolic health scientist, functional medicine educator, and board-certified holistic health practitioner. After an injury ended his Navy SEAL training, he shifted to personal training, discovered functional lab testing, and became a leading expert in metabolic health. He founded the Metabolic Solutions Institute and its nonprofit arm dedicated to advancing mental health science. He also created the Mental M.A.P lab panel, the SMHP certificate program, and the Neuroceuticals supplement line. Take it away, Brendan.
Thank you so much, Adair. I really appreciate you hosting me. It's been great to meet you and get to know you a little bit. Hopefully we get to hang out at a future conference. And to the audience, I wish we were all in a big conference room so I could see all your lovely faces, but thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day, stepping away from your practice to advance your education. And certainly I want to make this worthwhile. I want to cram in as many juicy clinical pearls as possible in the allotted time. So without further ado, let's go and get started. And thank you so much to Vibrant for having me and giving me this opportunity to share this information with you all. So skip forward through these initial slides if you want to learn a little bit more about me, my rather eclectic background that Adair alluded to. So I really come from the world of metabolic health, fitness. I was a nutrition coach, personal trainer, metabolic technician before I got into functional medicine. And I feel like that was really kind of the perfect background to allow me to thrive in this space, because certainly it's taken a while, but now I feel there's this convergence of more health coach principles and functional medicine principles kind of meeting in the middle. We see a lot of doctors starting to beat the drum of metabolic health and lifestyle medicine. And we see health coaches stepping more into the clinical realm. So I'm just really passionate about this industry, this movement that is functional medicine. And this is what I stand for. I really believe prevention is the best treatment, and the greatest medicine ball is to teach people how not to need it. So everything I do, whether it's through the research foundation that I started, my institute, my practice, all the wonderful collaborations and partnerships I do in the space, such as with Vibrant Wellness, it's all with this rhetoric in mind. So let's go ahead and dive in, looking at our learning objectives today. I think everybody here has probably done some studying within the realm of mycotoxicosis and SIRS, biotoxin illness, maybe Lyme disease, stealth infections, and of course, mast cell activation syndrome usually gets kind of lumped into that conversation. I want to hopefully expand the conversation and also get into some of the nuance and the technicalities. And what I really hope to do is equip you all with clinical strategies to not only navigate these at times complex cases with confidence, but also be able to really drive exponential clinical outcomes here. So we'll see if I'm able to accomplish that. Now, my career, especially back to my Navy SEAL aspirations when I was 18 years old, I could have never predicted that someday my whole career would center around one specific type of cell in the human body. And certainly some of you that maybe have been paying attention to my work, you know where I'm going with this, but the microglial cells, the innate immune cell of the parenchyma or functional tissue of the central nervous system. So this is sort of my working theory, if you will. Mental illness is largely, not exclusively, but largely an epigenetic phenomenon driven by oxidative stress, inflammation, and neuroendocrine dysregulation. So I actually teach a integrative systems biology approach to mental health using more of a root cause model. And certainly when we consider a lot of etiological root cause factors, this statement, I feel, encompasses all of them. And so certainly I'll spend the rest of my life probably pioneering this work as I have been for the past 6 years. And so this is where, when we look at this interface of mold, mycotoxin exposure, microbiota disturbances, and how this really drives this dysfunctional neuroimmunological sequelae, if you will, looking at how the mast cells are becoming activated, the macrophages are activated, the microglial cells are becoming activated. and how this can really amplify chronic inflammation and neuroinflammation that might be presenting as an exacerbation of various mental health predispositions, or even long-term chronically could manifest as neurodegeneration. And so certainly with the subject of mold illness, I was really heavily niched with mold back in around 2018, 2019. Literally my whole career and world just centered around mold, mold, mold. And I was like, well, why do I really care about mold? And there's actually a pretty tragic, traumatic backstory that we don't have time to get into. But certainly I had this like vendetta against mold, and I've since expanded and developed this whole framework around neuroinflammation and microglial activation syndrome. So I want to introduce you guys to this concept because I'm sure many of you are already somewhat familiar with mast cell activation syndrome. Now, I think it's important to recognize we can't always myopically focus on a single cell type, right? Or blame the cell for behaving in a dysfunctional way. I don't think it's so much that the mast cells or microglial cells or macrophages or T cells are behaving inappropriately. They're simply responding to the milieu and the microenvironment that they're spending their time in. So if we want to change the cellular behavior and dynamics, we have to change the cytokine milieu. We have to modulate the microenvironment that these cells are residing in. And so I coined the phrase microglial activation syndrome back in about 2019 to really describe the sort of neuropsychiatric perturbations and mental health symptoms that can arise when we have excess microglial activation within the central nervous system, this neuroinflammatory cytokine storm that directly disrupts our cognition, neural health, neuroplasticity, neurotransmission, and so much more. So certainly when we look at this rather succinct yet comprehensive list of just some of the factors that can contribute to microglial activation, it's not just mold. That's going to be what we focus on today. But of course, it can be various pro-inflammatory cytokines or advanced glycation end products and hyperglycemia, hyperinsulinemia, more metabolic perturbations, or other forms of hidden stressors that might be disturbing their physiology. So I at least wanted to introduce you guys to this concept so that way we can draw these parallels between mast cell activation syndrome, microglial activation syndrome, and how mold and mycotoxins can really exacerbate all of the above here. Now, with these microglial cells, right, they're with us throughout our whole life. They really are with us from early embryonic development all the way through death. They have relatively long cellular lives. They have a slower turnover. They only make up about 10 to 15% of the brain cell population. So they're small but mighty. And I like to think of them both as the sentinels of the central nervous system. They're the guardians of the central nervous system, but they are also the architects. They largely regulate neurodevelopment in early embryonic development. So certainly we could have a whole separate lecture on maternal health and pre and perinatal health and how the mother's metabolic or inflammatory status is going to directly modulate the activity of the microglial cells that are quite literally building the neural networks in the fetus, right? Now, anybody that's studied immunology or macrophage morphology or microglial activation knows that these microglial cells have various phenotypes. And so this graphic, I think, does a pretty good job of illustrating this. So on the right side of this graphic, we have more of the classic M1 pro-inflammatory cytotoxic phenotype for the microglial cells. So they're releasing a lot of pro-inflammatory and oxidative mediators that contribute to the neuroinflammatory process. Now, of course, as we can all appreciate, inflammation is really the cleansing fire that the immune system uses to remodel tissues and to fight off pathogens, right? So obviously, if we have some sort of foreign invader like a viral infection or a fungal infection, what have you, it will activate these glial cells and drive them into their M1 pro-inflammatory phenotype in contrast to the M2 anti-inflammatory neuroprotective phenotype. Now, there are actually subtypes in activation state. So there's even a M1A, M1B, M1C, as well as M2A, B, and C. There's dark microglia or aged microglia. So there are subtypes that make this a little bit more nuanced, but for the sake of today, understanding the classic paradigm of M1 being more pro-inflammatory, M2 being more anti-inflammatory, or then there's the more inactive state, or what we call quiescent, which doesn't really mean inactive. It just means they're not activated, they're not triggered. So they're more just in their patrolling kind of survey. I like to use the analogy of it's like the police officer that's doing his rounds around the city. He's just patrolling, keeping the peace. He's not really doing a whole lot other than surveying the environment. So with these microglial cells, they're very, very dynamic, so much so that it's really not as simple as M1 or M2. They can actually be a little bit of both at the same time. And that's what I really like about this graphic that I made is it illustrates both the M1 pro-inflammatory phenotype and the M2 anti-inflammatory phenotype essentially at the same time. Again, these are highly dynamic cells that have co-evolved within us for hundreds of thousands of years. So we should honor just how dynamic and pleiotropic they can really be. And I would really argue with the body of my work that maintaining some degree of microglial homeostasis is, in my opinion, the biggest factor that really determines our mental health, cognitive health, and neural health long-term for the rest of our lives, which is why all of my work really centers around these particular cells. So now that we have a basic framework of understanding of the innate immune system within the central nervous system with these guardians and architects that are the microglia, as opposed to the macroglia or the astrocytes that we'll talk about a little bit more momentarily. But now as we start looking at mold, mycotoxin exposure, and mast cell activation syndrome, I want to open with this statement, which is we are all exposed to mold. We do not all develop mold illness. I think this is a really important point for all of us to keep in mind, right? Mold and fungus is ubiquitous in the environment. It plays a critical role as a recycling organism within our ecosystem, whether we're talking about a rainforest outside or the microbiota within us, right? I really believe these fungi play critical roles in our overall ecology and physiological processes. So at a very simplified level, I think mold illness really comes down to the degree of exposure and toxic burden, the quantity of exposure and the duration of exposure in contrast to our metabolic and immunological resilience, right? So if we have a low degree of exposure and a high degree of resilience, we're going to probably be okay. We probably won't develop symptoms really. And certainly I could rattle off a lot of case studies, even myself living in a moldy apartment previously, I never really developed symptoms. Now, in contrast though, what if we have a high degree of exposure and a low degree of immunological resilience, such as if they're immunosuppressed? Of course, we know mycotoxins by nature are pretty immunosuppressive, or if they're chronically stressed or dealing with other metabolic perturbations, maybe they have metabolic syndrome and diabetes and dyslipidemia, sort of that standard American metabolism, that chronic disease picture. Maybe they have the genetic predispositions with HLA or MTHFR or CBS or NOS or any of the other naughty SNPs that might make them less resilient to the noxious effects of mycotoxins. But I think this is a pretty profound statement to keep in mind. Even I was talking to Adair before the presentation started, and one of my own staff members is going through a remediation right now. And so I was just reminding her of this, right? Let's go ahead and do the remediation. Let's go ahead and take some prophylactic intervention strategies, but also let's not excessively pathologize it or create our own nocebo response, right? Placebo is we believe something is helping us, so it makes us feel better. Nocebo is the opposite. Nocebo is if I believe something is hurting me, I'm going to basically create my own symptoms through a psychosomatic stress response, right? So I think as practitioners, we have to be really careful with approaching these seemingly complex cases unbiased and impartial. Let's let the data do the talking and use lab testing and objective data points to really navigate the complexity with confidence so we can provide reassurance to our clients and patients. So let's dive in here. Certainly, I think we can all appreciate that mold exposure is very pervasive. It's all over the place. It's not a matter of if you're being exposed, it's how much, how often, and how resilient are you to those effects. So whether it's we're ingesting mycotoxins, especially as mast mycotoxins, which can be hiding within our produce that we might be eating through the diet. Of course, if we have water damage to our home or apartment or our office building or CrossFit gym that we might be working out that has, a leaky roof, So we can obviously ingest, we can inhale, we can absorb through our skin. And then, of course, the aspect of colonization. So we have to be thinking about the environmental exposure, but also perhaps in endogenous fungal colonization, such as a microbiome dysbiosis, if you will. Is there candida or aspergillus overgrowing within the gastrointestinal microbiota, for example, or maybe in the sinuses? So maybe the source of exposure is endogenous. Maybe it's within us. And we can obviously use a number of lab tests, such as the gut zoomer, organic acids, mycotoxin testing, fungal antibodies, to navigate the likelihood of some of these incidents here. So this is a good diagram that I created to just illustrate as we're, breathing in some of these mycotoxins and fungal fragments, mold spores. They can easily access the parenchyma or functional tissue of the central nervous system through the cribriform plate here. So this can directly drive mast cell activation at the perivascular space. So we have a lot of mast cells that reside outside the blood-brain barrier within that perivascular space before the astrocyte end feet wrap around the glia limitans, for example. So we have a lot of mast cells right within that kind of blood-brain barrier perivascular space that then, as we're being exposed to these mycotoxins, now we have more mast cell activation, as well as then the crosstalk with the astrocytes as well as the microglia. So before you know it, we have this oxidative pro-inflammatory storm going on locally within the brain. Now, of course, you can imagine if this is also affecting our pulmonary tract, gastrointestinal tract, so on and so forth, this could be a compounding issue. So as far as looking at how mold and mycotoxins trigger mast cell activation, I think we all know that fungus and fungal toxins can contribute to mast cell activation and degranulation. I like to get a little bit more granular with the specificity of what's going on here. So for one thing, there's various fungal associated molecular patterns or beta glucans that can activate various toll-like receptors like TLR2 that reside on the membrane of the mast cell, as well as C-type lectin receptors like dectin-1 is a big one that recognizes the beta glucan from fungus. So that will directly activate the mast cell and contribute to degranulation. But then we also have the mycotoxins that are disrupting the cell membrane, the mitochondrial membrane, inhibiting oxidative phosphorylation in ATP synthesis, as well as stimulating what's called the aryl hydrocarbon receptor. So it's actually a transcription factor that resides within the cytoplasm of cells, including mast cells. And you can kind of think of the aryl hydrocarbon receptor as like a smoke detector, right? So when mycotoxins such as ochratoxin A bind to this aryl hydrocarbon receptor, which is a transcription factor, it's going to modulate, it's going to set off the alarm, set off the smoke alarm, which is going to change the cellular dynamics that can then drive more inflammation, more degranulation and histamine release, as well as disrupting the ability to heal the barriers, such as the intestinal barrier, the blood-brain barrier. So various physiological barriers become compromised further, more leakiness that then allows mycotoxins, endotoxins, and other pathogen-associated molecular patterns to translocate and really drive more of a systemic inflammatory response. So this is a nice little diagram that illustrates just some of the different types of receptors. Now, there's a lot more to this conversation. Obviously, I want to stay focused on the mold and mycotoxin piece. But I do feel that mast cell activation syndrome has become synonymous with mold and mycotoxins, but mold and mycotoxins are far from the only things that are modulating the activity of the mast cells. For example, hormones have a tremendous impact on mast cell stability. Estrogen at increasing concentrations actually activates mast cells. So if you have somebody that's more estrogen dominant, for example, that's going to contribute to more mast cell instability. Whereas in contrast, testosterone is actually a very potent mast cell stabilizer. So imagine if they have really high estrogen and really low testosterone, which is often part of the chronic inflammatory picture because inflammation drives aromatization and drives that estrogen dominance. But also progesterone is a major mast cell stabilizer. So maybe they have PCOS and maybe they're a little bit more estrogen dominant, no progesterone, testosterone could be a little bit higher, low. And there's so many other factors too, like lipopolysaccharide, of course, endotoxins from gram-negative bacteria, from a leaky dysbiotic gut, as well as peptidoglycan from gram positive. So for example, if some of you are using the gut zoomer, which is a great stool analysis, we can analyze the microbiota composition and look at some of the phyla ratios. So we often will see a high firmicutes to bacteroides ratio. That firmicutes expresses a lot of the peptidoglycan that can activate the mast cells through TLR2 in particular. But then if you see elevated proteobacteria, which is a lot of our gram negative endotoxin lipopolysaccharide expressing bacteria, like Klebsiella, for example, this can obviously drive more mast cell activation or microglial activation, macrophage activation through the TLR4 complex in particular. So there's a lot of variables that we might want to be considering with what is either destabilizing or stabilizing the mast cells. And obviously then, what strategies can we use to ameliorate this by reducing toxic burden, aiding in hormone balance, and so much more. So this is a good graphic I created to illustrate some of this. Now, I do want to point out the mast cells, like I said before, are really in that perivascular space. So basically above the basal membrane of the endothelial blood-brain barrier, but essentially below the limitons where the astrocyte end feet are wrapped around here. So this mast cell anatomically would be super small, somewhere kind of right in here is where they reside. So as those mast cells are degranulating and releasing all this histamine, for example, we do actually have histamine receptors like the H2R on the blood-brain barrier itself. And so if we have increasing concentrations of histamine, that can actually disrupt the blood-brain barrier itself directly, as well as we have histamine receptors on the macroglia or astrocytes themselves, as well as the microglia. So the point I'm trying to really illustrate here is that histamine itself can disrupt the blood-brain barrier and stimulate neuroinflammation, right? So I think that's an important concept to understand. Of course, we have our eosinophils that are kind of like the firefighters that release histaminase or diamine oxidase in order to try to calm the inflammation being induced by the histamine here. So I think this really summarizes everything that I just spoke to. So there's a lot of crosstalk and there's this huge gut-brain axis interface that we have to be taken into account. So of course, it depends on what's going on contextually. Are we talking about more an environmental exposure or endogenous overgrowth within the microbiota? And this is where looking for the fungal species on the gut zoomer, but also using the organic acid markers that can reflect colonization in the gut. Of course, the mycotoxin excretion with the urinary testing, but also I think the fungal antibodies gets overlooked. And I think that can be a critical piece because we want to see, is there fungus overgrowing in the gut, but also is it breaching the intestinal lumen? Is it becoming invasive? Is it becoming systemic as well? So I think the serological testing with fungal antibodies can be really helpful here. So nice little schematic of a leaky gut. We all understand intestinal permeability, so I don't need to go over the basics, but the mast cells are in high abundance within the lamina propria. So of course, if you're running your wheat zoomer and running your gut zoomer and you see those indices of intestinal inflammation and leaky gut, such as the anti-zonulin and anti-lipopolysaccharide on wheat zoomer, for example, we know that we have intestinal permeability. We can obviously assess the microbiota composition. I would really argue that mold illness is heavily influenced by the microbiota. There's a lot of different bacterial species like lactobacillus and bifidobacterium, or even bacillus subtilis, or even fungal species like Saccharomyces species that can actually bind and neutralize mycotoxins within the gut. So certainly I'm a big advocate of using microbiota replenishing, sort of modulating the terrain, trying to crowd out the bad guys, make sure that we're boosting diversity, keystone species abundance like Faecalibacterium prosnitzi or Akkermansia that everybody's raving about these days. But we have to make sure we're addressing the microbiota as part of a comprehensive approach to mold illness and mast cell activation syndrome. So now evolving the schematic a little bit further, this is my aspergillus one. So of course you can imagine if we have some of those organic acid markers on the oat test, along with various maybe aspergillus related mycotoxins in the urine, maybe we also see some fungal antibodies and disturbances in their blood work. So we could have a little bit of an invasive aspergillosis that's then driving this sort of systemic microtoxicosis that might then, of course, drive that chronic inflammatory response syndrome that so many of us are very familiar with. And I love to use a lot of different lab tests to really map this out. We talked about the gut zoomer and organic acids. And I do have a slide towards the end of the presentation where I'll show my favorite lab tests and specific biomarkers to use to really plot this out. Because I want to make sure we have as clear of a picture as possible. So that way we can make the best bio-individualized protocol that's going to address their specific issues. So now, of course, as I alluded to earlier, it's not just the fungus and the mycotoxins, but of course that lipopolysaccharide, the endotoxemia component that can drive all of this and exacerbate all of this and stimulate the mast cells, as well as the peptidoglycan from gram-positive bacteria in particular. So you can spend more time checking out those graphics. I know they're relatively comprehensive, but just for the sake of time. So now looking at how these mast cells are directly contributing to neuroinflammation, of course, they can disrupt the tight junctions, both in our gut as well as the blood-brain barrier. And like I said before, the histamine can drive neuroinflammation directly. But of course, there's all these pro-inflammatory mediators that are being released as well. So there's a direct crosstalk going on here between the microglial cells and the mast cells locally within that central nervous system, maybe between the perivascular space and then the parenchyma there. So it drives this sort of neuroinflammatory cytokine storm. And of course, as the blood-brain barrier becomes more permeable and more disrupted, it becomes a very vicious cycle. And part of the problem with neuroinflammation, it's a fire that can keep itself going. Because as we have rising neuroinflammation, and that could be causing more tissue damage within the central nervous system, well, now we're going to have more damage associated molecular patterns that are then binding onto pattern recognition receptors on the microglia that just further amplify their pro-inflammatory effect. And so there's a lot of research out there that even shows this of even if the initial pro-inflammatory stimuli, the initial trigger might get removed, whether it was mold exposure or endotoxemia from a leaky dysbiotic gut. But even if the initial trigger is removed, that doesn't mean the fire has been put out, right? If you think about a forest fire, well, just because maybe the original like cigarette butt that started the forest fire, that might have been put out, but it doesn't mean the forest fire has been put out yet. So as practitioners, we have to try to calm the fire, stabilize the mast cells while ultimately addressing the root cause factors that started the fire to begin with. So that same diagram, again, just to emphasize this crosstalk between the mast cells and the degranulation, as well as the glial cells with the astrocytes. They also have their own different phenotypes of A1 and A2, just like the glial cells have the microglia have their M1 and M2. And certainly too, imagine, for example, I talked about how estrogen is a very potent stimulator of mast cells and progesterone is more stabilizing. Testosterone is more stabilizing. So then imagine if they're being exposed to various mycotoxins like zearalenone that has a more estrogenic effect in general. Or we also know that, well, as estrogen is rising, that's going to stimulate more mast cell degranulation, but it's also going to decrease the expression of diamine oxidase that breaks it down, while also kind of clogging up our methylation intracellular metabolism pathway with HNMT. So again, I picture somebody that might be metabolically compromised. Maybe they have the naughty, notorious HLA and MTHFR, but then they're estrogen dominant, lacking progesterone, lacking testosterone. They have a lot of dysbiosis and permeability. You can imagine the type of individual. And of course, then they might have symptoms like dysautonomia and PODS and vertigo and migraines and all these unpleasant symptoms. And, unfortunately, they often get kind of written off in the conventional world. There can be a lot of layers. And so we have to take this more holistic approach because we can't do a simple monotherapy with, one mechanism of action. We have to modulate a myriad of mechanisms here to essentially restore proper physiology. So this is one of my favorite diagrams I think I've ever created because this is really the crux of all my work. Everything that I do is really focusing on this leaky brain microglial activation picture here. So we've got this microglial cell that's morphed into its M1 pro-inflammatory phenotype, releasing all these different mediators, things like the interleukin-1 beta, IL-6, TNF-alpha, interferon gamma, high mobility group box 1 protein, things like MMP9, these metalloproteinases that break down the extracellular matrix. I think a lot of you are probably familiar with quinolinic acids, my favorite marker on the organic acids test, and the kynurenic acid and quinolinic acid. Those tryptophan metabolites also activate that aryl hydrocarbon receptor that I talked about before. So they can also sort of set off the smoke alarm within mast cells and other types of cells. And there's a lot of other mediators that we could get into. Now over here, I want to highlight this because it's one of the biomarkers that I have listed on a slide towards the end of the presentation. But neurofilament light chain, this marker is not used enough. It's not talked about enough. Most neurologists don't even really know about it yet, but it's literally a marker of axon damage to the neuron. So it's kind of like the troponin of neurology, if you will. Troponin being a marker of cardiomyocyte damage. Neurofilament light chain is essentially a marker of neuron damage. So we can quantify this. This is something that we can measure in the blood, and it's directly reflective of neuron damage in the brain. I don't know about you all, but that gets me really excited because I want to quantify that. If somebody is having a lot of neurological or neuropsychiatric symptoms, I want to know how much neuroinflammation do they have? I want to get objective baseline measurements, or how much neuron damage do they have? So we can use neurofilament light chain as a marker of neuron damage. We can use glial fibrillary acidic protein as a marker of astrocyte activation, or looking at things like quinolinic acid on the organic acids test, or serum neopterin as indicators of macrophage and glial activation. So we don't have to guess about what's going on. Certainly, I think a lot of us that are veterans and experienced, you can probably trust your intuition and at times maybe assume that they might have neuroinflammation. But let's get really objective and quantify this so we have a baseline. And that way, over the course of time, we can effectively track progress physiologically, because certainly something like mycotoxin excretion in the urine can fluctuate all over the place. Antibodies with serological testing can fluctuate a little bit. So we need to have these biomarkers so we can make sure that our protocols are working and we're moving things in the right direction. So certainly a lot to be said about that. But for the sake of time, moving this forward, I mentioned before how the mycotoxins directly damage our mitochondria. They're disrupting our cell membranes, the mitochondrial membranes, and inhibiting ATP production and activating those aryl hydrocarbon receptors that I've alluded to a few times here. So then now we have this mitochondrial dysfunction that's contributing to the fatigue and the malaise and the brain fog, while directly driving more oxidative stress, more nitric oxide synthase uncoupling. And of course, oxidative stress and inflammation, they perpetuate one another. They're the two great plagues of the human metabolism. I often feel like oxidative stress is sort of like in the shadow of inflammation, if you will, right? And so I love the new oxidative stress profile from Vibrant Wellness. It's an amazing tool that we can really quantify the oxidative burden. So I think that's a great panel. And let's also keep in mind with mycotoxin exposure and biotoxin illness, mycotoxins primarily hurt the human body through oxidative stress. It's actually not inflammation. It's primarily oxidative stress that then can also drive inflammation, right? So using the oxidative stress panel is a great way that we can map that. And certainly when we consider the fact that there is a whole theory of mitochondrial dysfunction for mental illness, that's its own theory of mental illness. So looking at the bioenergetics, and candidly, how do you think you're going to feel mentally or cognitively if you don't have adequate cellular energy production and you have way too much oxidative stress? That, guess what, can just further activate the glial system and drive more neuroinflammation and excitotoxicity, right? So you can start seeing how this is a compounding issue. Now, then turning to look at, well, how do these mycotoxins disrupt neurotransmitter balance? So you can check out these notes, but I'd rather teach off my graphics here. So this is that kynurenine pathway that many of you are probably familiar with. I feel like it's a pretty famous pathway, and anybody that's been using organic acids testing knows about it. So again, looking at this blood-brain barrier picture and the central nervous system. So we have that IDO1 enzyme, that's the rate-limiting enzyme with tryptophan metabolism. Now, even under normal physiological conditions, still about 90% of our tryptophan is going to go through the IDO1 pathway to either yield thymurenic acid, which is more neuroprotective and an NMDA receptor antagonist, or quinolinic acid, that's much more neurotoxic and can actually cause leaky brain itself and drive more microglial activation. Now, ultimately, the point of this pathway is to yield NAD, but we can measure these metabolites on organic acids to look at the thymurenic acid and quinolinic acid ratio. And how does that contrast with the 5-HIAA, the serotonin metabolite? So essentially, you can kind of think of this as like a tryptophan shunt or steal, if you will, where under pro-inflammatory conditions, more of that tryptophan is going away from our serotonin, melatonin, and into a potentially neurotoxic quinolinic acid picture. And some of the major stimulators of this pathway, guess what? Lipopolysaccharide. Now, I want to make a special note here with neuroinflammation research, right? So scientists that are studying neuroinflammation, let's say they're doing an in vitro model. So they take a petri dish, they put some immortalized microglial cells in there, and now they want to activate those glial cells into the pro-inflammatory M1 phenotype. You know what they applied to do that in the petri dish? Lipopolysaccharide. Literally, LPS is really the most potent stimulator of microglial cells, so much so that it's the standard of how neuroinflammation research is conducted. So then they'll essentially use the LPS to provocate the glial cells and then apply some kind of therapeutic to see, can we switch the M1 pro-inflammatory to an M2 anti-inflammatory, whether it's a monoclonal antibody or like vitamin D at high doses has been used in such studies, for example. Now, that's not the only inducing factor. There's also amyloid beta. So that opens up conversation around Alzheimer's or different cytokines, such as the interferons and interferon gamma in particular. So this is sort of one biochemical mechanism by which inflammation and mycotoxin exposure can directly disrupt our neurotransmitters. But there's also a lesser known pathway here. So this is essentially the biopterin or BH4 pathway. A lot of you that have studied neurochemistry know that reduced biopterin is a major cofactor to produce a lot of our neurotransmitters, including the gasotransmitter nitric oxide, as well as serotonin and dopamine and our catecholamines. So we have to have adequate BH4. There's obviously a heavy methylation implication here, but it's all regulated by this rate limiting enzyme, guanosine triphosphate cyclohydrolase 1 or GTPCH. So this runs essentially in parallel with IDO1 that we were just looking at on the last slide here. And it has a lot of similar inducing factors like lipopolysaccharide, interferon gamma, really being the top two. And so essentially what happens is when we have mast cell activation, mycotoxin exposure, rising inflammation, this will stimulate this intracellular biochemical pathway in tandem with the kynurenine pathway. And so instead of getting adequate reduced BH4 so we can make our neurotransmitters, we get elevations in neopterin, which is that biomarker that I alluded to a few slides ago. This is a biomarker we can measure in the blood, and it's very much reflective of Th1 cell-mediated immunity because it's stimulated by interferon gamma released by Th1 T helper cells. So you can actually measure the serum neopterin and contrast that with quinolinic acid on the neurotransmitter panel or the organic acids profile. So you can get more insight into how the neurotransmission is being disturbed by upstream noxious mast cell activation and microglial activation. And of course, then we have to appreciate how mycotoxins can gobble up and use up a lot of our reduced glutathione and even inhibit methylation. We know that lipopolysaccharide can inhibit methionine synthase, which is a rate limiting enzyme in the methylation cycle, as well as these mycotoxins driving oxidative stress that is depleting our glutathione reserves and potentially modulating the activity of some of these methylation related enzymes. So not that we have time to get into a full methylation biochemistry lecture here, but certainly we have to be considering the amount of folate that's being ingested and converted into methylfolate. Do they have MTHFR? Do they have CBS or any other naughty SNPs that might be interfering with their ability to create the methyl donor S-adenosyl methionine that we need to metabolize intracellular histamine through H&MT to produce glutathione, to renew the enterocytes in our intestinal lining that might be damaged in response to excess mycotoxin burden and mast cell activation. The list goes on and on and on. So we can see this interconnectedness of all these major systems, which is why as functional providers, as much as we might have some of our favorite subjects or root causes of interest, we can't be biased. I don't think there's any room for bias in clinical practice. We have to be unbiased and impartial and let the lab testing really elucidate what do we do here? What's the next step to take action to move the needle on this person's physiology and health? Now, of course, as methylation is becoming disrupted, well, guess what? Homocysteine starts climbing. So now we develop a hyperhomocystinemia. And guess what? Homocysteine actually acts as an agonist of the NMDA receptors. We have NMDA or N-methyl D-aspartate receptors on the blood-brain barrier. And so when we have high blood levels of homocysteine, which we can measure on the vibrant methylation panel, it'll actually activate this intracellular beta-selectin pathway that decreases the expression of claudin 5, a major tight junction protein that holds the blood-brain barrier together. So even methylation disturbances and hyperhomocystinemia can directly drive leaky brain and then glial activation or even excitotoxic mechanisms as well. So this is where I created the Mental M.A.P as essentially a custom lab panel that I use to quantify some of these parameters using key biomarkers that I have listed on a subsequent slide here. So I like to use some really comprehensive blood work in conjunction with a lot of vibrant testing here. So I've mentioned all of these throughout the presentation, but now I want to kind of run through. And I'm not saying that we have to run all of these in every single case. Certainly, let's use some clinical critical thinking to practice some discretion of, when does it make sense to run the tick-borne 2.0 or whatnot. But as I alluded to, I think we all love the total tox. I mean, what an amazing cost-effective panel that we can use to try to quantify toxic burden, right? Is it metals? Is it toxins? Is it mycotoxins? Is it all the above? It's, always going to be some naughty mixture of all the above, but we can really get that baseline on the toxic burden. And as I alluded to with organic acids, there's a lot of clues that we can extrapolate from organic acids, but the main reason I included it in this presentation is for those fungal overgrowth indices in the fungal section of the microbial organic acid markers, as well as then on the same panel, we get things like pyroglutamic acid or 2-hydroxybutyric acid, reflective of methylation and glutathione activity, or mitochondrial function with succinate, for example, as well as the neurotransmitter metabolites like the quinolinic acid, inernic acid, serotonin metabolite, 5-HIAA. So we can really get a lot of bang for your buck with the organic acids test. And then, of course, you can just run it on the same urine sample, which makes it really, really convenient. I think the serology is important with the fungal antibody testing. I feel like that panel gets overlooked. But as I said, I do want to try to see, is there fungal overgrowth in the gut, a microbiome overgrowth or dysbiosis? But then also, is it breaching the intestinal lumen? Is it becoming invasive? Is it driving an adaptive immune response systemically, right? Is it more acute with elevated IgM? Is it a little bit more historical with elevated IgG, right? So then when we corroborate those findings with clinical biomarkers, we can get a pretty good working picture as good as technology can really yield. Now, like I said, that oxidative stress panel, which is new and really, really exciting. I love oxidative stress. It's one of the main drivers of mental health dysfunction and metabolic illness. So certainly I'm excited to have a really expansive panel that looks at a lot of different indices of oxidative stress, like 8-OHDG, which is one of the more famous ones, or malondialdehyde, or nitrotyrosine, which I've been dying to see somebody put nitrotyrosine on a panel for a while. But as I alluded to with the methylation conversation, and certainly this one presentation could be like 5 different topics. But I think as a practitioner, what's really cool is when we look at the interconnectedness of all these systems, all these mechanisms, and how we can use the comprehensive testing to map all of this out. Now, I love the neural zoomer because then if we want to look at, okay, do we have more leaky brain and neuroautoimmunity? So why don't we get a baseline of their antibodies towards different brain proteins, such as some of the markers that I spoke about throughout this presentation, like the glial fibrillary acidic protein, the Neuroimmune is actually testing antibodies against that. Now, I think we can all appreciate that mold causes misery and misery loves company, right? So it's usually not just mold and biotoxin exposure, especially with the immunosuppressive nature of mycotoxins. We have to be considering stealth infections as part of this, especially when you're looking at their blood work and you see elevations in inflammation and immune activation. And I'll refer to those markers on the next slide here. But I love the tick-borne 2.0 because even just recently in one of my mold cases, there was elevated strep A antibodies on the tick-borne 2.0. And of course, she also has a history of OCD, and that opens up this whole kind of pandas dialogue, or even Borrelia antibodies. So I love the combination of the serology with the PCR to see, do we have potentially an active self-infection that might be sort of brewing under the surface. And then, as I alluded to, I could talk for a long time about the power of the garden of life that is the microbiota. So we can use that gut zoomer to not only assess the composition of the microbiota, but also assess the gastrointestinal physiology. Do we see elevations in calprotectin and lysozyme and lactoferrin and MMP9 indicating more inflammation within the intestinal tissues? And is the inflammation only in the intestinal tissues, or has it become systemic and or neuro, right? A lot of the schematics that I showed today show, gut, systemic, neuro, and we have biomarkers that we can really precisely get an idea of, is there inflammation in the central nervous system, systemically and or gastrointestinal, because that might change our approach with our intervention and protocol to some extent. So these are the major vibrant tests that I would consider as part of this. And then these are some of my favorite biomarkers. Now, certainly we don't have time to do like a deep dive on all of these individual markers. So I'll just do an overview highlight here. So when it comes to assessing the quantity of inflammation and immune activation, not that I have anything against good old fashioned C-reactive protein. I still use it, but I don't think it's the best systemic inflammatory marker anymore. It's a little bit more old school. I think we have better markers now. So I really like to use galectin-3, which I'll offer a clinical pearl. Galectin-3 is more so reflective of M2 phenotype for macrophages and microglial cells, whereas neopterin, listed right here, is more reflective of M1. So if you look at the neopterin in contrast to the galectin-3, that'll give you an idea of all of the macrophages in your body in the microglia. Are they more so polarized and leaning towards the M1 phenotype, which would be reflected with neopterin and guanylinic acid? Or is it leaning a little bit more towards the tissue remodeling, which is going to be more so represented by galectin-3? Now, Glyc-A is just my favorite systemic inflammatory marker. I think it does a really good job of broadly capturing systemic inflammation. And then I'd love to make sure that we're using alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone. I think that's an amazing marker, really reflective of, is their body still fighting for them, or is it really depleted, right? I'd rather see a high alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone than a low value. And there's some other great ones like CD4, CD8, or procalcitonin, reflective of the endotoxin burden. It's really a marker of sepsis, so we can use it functionally as an indicator of metabolic endotoxemia. And then complement C4A, that one is a little bit of a conundrum, not quite as much research on that, but you will sometimes see somebody might have overall pretty good looking inflammatory markers, maybe low or normal, but then they could have a C4A through the roof, reflective of biotoxin exposure and SIRS. I mentioned the neurofilament light chain as a marker of neuron damage, or the glial fibrillary acidic protein as a marker of astrocyte activation. And then I just want to briefly highlight with the histamine and MCAS, this is a tricky one. I think a lot of us recognize that when it comes to assessing mast cell activation, you kind of have to catch it in the moment, right? Somebody could have a big mast cell flare in response to environmental input signals, or maybe they ingest something that doesn't sit well with them and causes a mast cell flare. So I think we all recognize that tryptase, serum tryptase, is the gold standard. However, it only has a half-life of about 2 hours. So unless you do the blood draw, basically during the mast cell flare or very shortly after, it's going to come back low normal. And I still think we should use it, but 9 times out of 10, it's going to come back low normal. Now, plasma histamine has a half-life of like 2 minutes. So I just don't really see the point in measuring plasma histamine for the most part. Whole blood histamine, I think, is a much more viable and stable biomarker. It has a half-life of more like 2 to 3 days. In whole blood histamine, it's not just including the plasma histamine, but also the intracellular histamine that is stored within the basophils, as well as to a lesser extent, circulating immature mast cells, but more so the basophils, right? Basophils are like big histamine balloons, right? And so that whole blood histamine in some ways is reflective of like histaminergic tone or histaminergic potential, right? So that full blood histamine doesn't necessarily that they have a ton of mast cell activation degranulation, but if we do have increasing numbers on whole blood histamine, and when I say elevated, I'm talking like, normal would be like 40 to 60. The highest I've ever seen is like 190 to put it into context. And that was somebody living in a water damaged home, for example. So I think whole blood histamine is a really valuable biomarker as part of the mast cell activation, histamine intolerance picture that kind of gets overlooked. And of course, some of the other core markers, glutathione, homocysteine, myeloperoxidase. Now, I do want to make a special note on cystatin C for liver and kidney function, as well as serum bile acids, because when we look at what tissues are mycotoxins most damaging towards, gastrointestinal tissues, liver, cardiovascular tissues, neural tissues, kidneys, right? The kidneys in particular can get really hard. And of course, when we're using urinary excretion testing, all of those toxins, metals, they have to go through the kidneys, right? Now, yes, you can eyeball blood urine nitrogen and creatinine, but those can be artificially inflated by other confounding variables. Cystatin C is the gold standard for kidney filtration. So for example, let's say that somebody's living in a moldy house, you've done an ERMI, you've seen the mold on the drywall or whatever. So they have mold exposure, but they're not excreting a lot on their total tox panel in the urine. Well, what's going on with their kidneys if they're a non-excreter, right? So cystatin C would be a great marker to assess the, glomerular filtration rate better than an estimated GFR. So I wanted to highlight that one as well. But as we start wrapping up here, so some supporting recovery strategies. Of course, we have to deal with the environment and sources of exposure, whether that's ingestion, inhalation, and of course, has it taken up shop endogenously? Do they have fungus in their sinuses, their pulmonary tract, their gastrointestinal tract? So obviously, the very first thing I want to be doing is lymphatic drainage, opening the detox pathways, and supporting the binding and sequestration. So things like serum bovine immunoglobulins, different types of probiotics, whether it's lactobacillus, bifidobacterium, bacillus subtilis, all of them are great. Obviously, different, more typical absorbent binders. Adsorbent things like charcoal, bentonite, humic fulvic acid, of course, glutathione, and acetylcysteine. You guys know these things pretty well. But then mast cell stabilization, of course, we can use like the quercetin, the luteolin, diamine oxidase, vitamin C, crumlin, sodium. But remember some of the nodes that I spoke to before. What if, you can take a lot of mast cell stabilizers, but if they have low progesterone, low testosterone, high stress with CRH that amplifies mast cell activation, maybe some of these botanicals aren't going to quite get the job done. So we have to be taking this systems biology approach, not just trying to use like botanical band-aids, if you will. I think that mitochondrial component is huge here too. So I like, CoQ10 and ALA, molecular hydrogen, resveratrol, vitamin K2 is a big one. Anything to boost mitochondrial function and get mitochondria working in our favor. It's hard to heal without adequate ATP. So the list goes on, but for the sake of time, because I want to make sure we have a few minutes for Q&A. So some final thoughts here, but I want to briefly show you a case study of what this could look like in real time here. So that way we have a tangible takeaway. So this is a client, I alluded to her throughout this presentation. And initially she was 53 at the time. Now she's postmenopausal. And there's a lot of layers to this case. I would literally say that this has been the most significant client in my whole career for a number of reasons. And she really had pretty severe symptomatology when she first came to me. There's a whole backstory that we don't need to get into today. But fortunately, budget was not an issue. Her sister was funding the whole thing and money was not an issue, which what a rare treat as a functional provider when we're able to do more extensive lab testing and get a clear picture of what is and what's not going on here. So we did really comprehensive blood work and a lot of different vibrant testing, wheat zoomer, organic acids, neurotransmitters, tick-borne 2.0, gut zoomer. The list goes on and on. So we've done loads of lab testing over the years. But on this slide, I really just wanted to highlight some of the physiological shifts and trends over the case of time, over the course of time. So you'll see a lot of the biomarkers that I've been alluding to throughout this presentation. Of course, good old fashioned C-reactive protein. Also, that serum neopterin that I alluded to is a marker of Th1, immunity and macrophage and microglial activation, things like MMP9, which a lot of us use in the SIRS world, that whole blood histamine. Now, if you notice her whole blood histamine, I said 40 to 60 was normal. When we first started, she was at 132. And then she climbed as high as 178, 177. And it was right around this time when she went through a whole mold remediation. We did antifungal protocols and mold detoxification. There was a lot going on here, but the mold remediation job alone was like $60,000. So mold can be a very detrimental thing and really cripple people, both psychologically, physiologically, and even financially. So I definitely have a lot of empathy for people trying to navigate mold illness and what they do about it, as well as that neurofilament light chain as that marker of neuronal damage and degeneration there. So you can, of course, get a copy of the slides and peruse all the graphics and all the charts here if you want to kind of see what this might look like in real time. But this is just a slide I wanted to include on just some of my favorite therapeutic supplements to start with. I did use all of these with this particular client and many more things, I will say, because of her OCD and reactivity. She tends to be the person that like, well, what else can I take and throw another supplement into the mix? So certainly compliance and consistency is where the healing happens. And this is where coaching psychology and motivational interviewing comes in very, very handy to implement our sophisticated protocols. But with that, we're right about at the top of the hour. So I really just want to emphasize, we have to make sure that we're tracking physiology more than we're just chasing root causes. If we don't assess the physiology in tandem with quantifying root cause factors, we're going to have some nuance that we don't really have clarity on. So let's make sure we're using all the lab testing effectively together to navigate this and track progress. And then I included a couple slides here if you want to learn more about my work. I have a whole MCAS ebook that you can check out and a training program. But with that, we're right about an hour. So I want to open it up for a little bit of Q&A hosted by Adair.
Thank you so much for that webinar. That was phenomenal. I didn't know so many things could exacerbate MCAS. Oh my gosh.
It's a deep topic, you know?
No doubt. So we've got a lot of questions. They started at the very beginning of the hour. So we're going to dive right in and go from top to bottom. First one came from Jan K. Do you prefer glutathione nebulizing and ultrasensitive charcoal binder versus, I don't even know, Welcoal and EDTA nasal spray?
Yeah. So, well call or like cholestyramine, you'll hear a lot of mold practitioners, especially like cholestyramine and well call. It's one of those, when it hits right, it can hit really, really well and it can move the needle very quickly. But especially with the more sensitive or individuals with more mast cell activation degranulation, sometimes it's a little too intense and can cause more of a flare. So I don't know how well this is really recognized, but I'm really big on the serum bovine immunoglobulins. Those are shown. I do have a relationship with Brian Kaufman, who's, the vice president over there, but the serum bovine immunoglobulins do a really good job of finding and neutralizing various mycotoxins and pathogen associated molecular patterns. And there's not really any upper limit to dosing. So I find it's a little bit more gentle of an approach. Plus with immunoglobulins having a different mechanism than like a charcoal that's sort of acting as like a magnet that's pulling the toxins along with it. So I'll use like a lot of the probiotics to bind along with glutathione and immunoglobulins first, because I just generally find that to be a more gentle start to the detoxification and binding process.
Got it. You find that a more gentle approach works better for folks with this type of condition.
Yeah, mostly, and a little bit more kind of palpable for them and tasteful.
Yeah. Next question. What determines whether or not you have mold illness susceptibility?
Big question with a lot of layers to it, right?
Okay.
So like I was saying, we're all going to get exposed to to mold at some point. We're all exposed every day. It's just a matter of how much. So there's certainly a lot of variables of course, the genetic predisposition. Everybody always touts the HLA, for example, or the MTHFR, the CVS. But as we all know, the genes are not the destiny; they're just the blueprint. And what matters more is that epigenetic expression. So certainly, I would really argue that metabolic status, and this is where I'm biased, but my background in metabolic health, fitness, nutrition, and lifestyle medicine, because especially with 88% of Americans metabolically ill, and now the whole industry is really starting to beat the drum with metabolic health. And guess what? That's earned through lifestyle behaviors. You don't get metabolic health out of a supplement or a medication, right? So this is where the more that we build up our metabolic health through stress reduction, circadian biology, sleep hygiene, exercise,
Mhm.
and resistance training, cardio, really clean nutrition, that's going to build up our resilience to the noxious effects of mold toxins more than anything else. However, my tragic, traumatic story that we don't have time to get into is a good example of somebody that is living the right lifestyle and very metabolically healthy, yet still was a canary in the coal mine that got wrecked by mold, right? So even if you're doing all the things right, you could still be more genetically compromised and susceptible, in which case it might be a little bit harder of a case, but there's still hope. There's always hope. So that's a relatively succinct answer.
Thanks for that. And just in case anyone has to jump because we're at the top of the hour, please know you will get the recording and the slides sent to you later. All right, next question on the same lines. What are your thoughts on some practitioners saying HLA is the only factor that determines susceptibility versus there can be many reasons one becomes susceptible? I think you might have just touched on this.
Yeah, I did, but I'll expand a little bit because I wouldn't agree that HLA is the only there's plenty of people that might be HLA positive and they can still heal and thrive. And this kind of goes back to my comments about like the nocebo effect, which I don't think we talk about enough in this industry, right? We all recognize the power of placebo. It's literally the gold standard of how we conduct clinical research by controlling for the placebo effect. But then nobody ever talks about the nocebo effect. So imagine, for example, if we didn't assess physiology using clinically established biomarkers and we just do urinary mycotoxin testing on everybody and then tell them, oh, look, you have some mold, mycotoxin excretion. So you have mold illness and MCAS and SIRS, right? If the clinical presentation and the clinical biomarkers don't corroborate that, you could then be like fear mongering. You're inducing a nocebo response where now they believe they have something they might not actually have. So this is why I'm really big on bringing it back to, yes, the clinical presentation, but clinical presentation is a subjective story based on perceived symptom. Clinical biomarkers, that's objective, reproducible, quantifiable data. So we can see, where is your immune system sitting right now? What are your inflammatory levels doing right now? So we can really objectively quantify all of this. And then what does it take to start moving the needle in the right way? But I would argue I'm less concerned about the genetic
Mhm.
predisposition and much more concerned about the current environment and lifestyle status and metabolic stature.
Got it. That makes total sense. When you were talking about all the other things that can cause histamine release, you talked about hormones. So someone is wondering, can you use hormone therapy as a tool for mast cell stabilization?
Yeah, 100%. This is where social media is a little funny, right? People kind of pick on you for a single post. And so it's like, I've put up other posts about mast cells of, well, hormones or lipopolysaccharide and gut dysbiosis and all these other contributors to either mast cell stabilization or destabilization. But everybody always just associates mast cells with mold and mycotoxins. And as I alluded to, it's so much more than that. There's a lot more going on within the milieu and or microenvironment that's going to change the cellular dynamic. So with hormones, absolutely. For example, if you have somebody that's being pumped full of estrogen, but they're testosterone's low, the progesterone's low, the stress response is high, that's a recipe for more mast cell activation. So vice versa too, maybe it's not so much an estrogen thing, but a lack of progesterone. And I can't tell you how many of my female clients are lacking progesterone and they have the PMS and PMDD and all these other really gnarly symptoms. So yeah, progesterone and testosterone therapy could really help with mast cell stabilization.
All right, thanks for covering that. Next question is a really long one. Can mold toxicity, particularly from Stachybotrys, cause neuropathic symptoms in both the upper and lower extremities, even without other mold-related symptoms? So question one there. Question two, can mold exposure aggravate pre-existing conditions or unmask others that might have remained asymptomatic, such as triggering latent vitamin B12 deficiency into symptomatic neuropathy, intensifying the effect of S1 nerve impingement from like herniated disc, etc.?
Yeah, there's a lot going on here, and this is where certainly when I'm doing presentations, you can kind of get these sort of like kitchen sink questions of like all the things, right? And with everybody, there's always going to be a lot of layers of what if they have multiple concussions from early in life or unresolved trauma that's really disturbing their neuroimmunology and kind of priming their immune cells, for example, and inhibiting vagal tone that can stabilize mast cells when activated properly. So I'm kind of inclined to say a sort of generic yes to this multi-part question here, but I do think it's important to use the testing and the biomarkers to really suss this out and delineate with what's going on. Because, for example, we wouldn't want to confuse like a neurological issue being caused by B12 deficiency. We can just use methylmalonic acid to figure that out pretty quickly. And, I think sometimes it's easy we want to blame all of our symptoms on this one thing. And it's more this loose association of, well, we have all these root cause factors going on. We have all these symptoms, but we can't really always draw a direct causal relationship. So we have to get a little bit more objective with the biomarkers to figure out, well, what are our priorities here? But yeah, I would say that mycotoxicosis, mycotoxin exposure can pretty much exacerbate just about any symptom you can really think of. It's kind of the great mimicker, if you will, sort of like Lyme disease.
Right. Sounds like a lot of tests, don't guess, and treat the patient, not the labs.
Yeah, I
Um,
would say so. Which is why I love all the vibrant testing so we can get really crystal clear on all this.
the next question, is it bad to take female estradiol hormones if a person has all these mold exposures?
Yeah, Jan, this is a really fascinating question. And of course, generic questions are not a replacement for that clinical interface with a practitioner and client relationship. But with the way that this is sort of framed in the context of, okay, so we have a woman that's taking bioidentical estradiol, which contextually could be a great thing, or maybe not so much. But, if they have like, let's say low alpha MSH and high MMP9, high C4A, high glyc high inflammatory markers and low sort of immunological reserve, if you will. Meanwhile, elevated mycotoxins, especially zearalenone, which is very estrogenic, I think there needs to be some investigation to determine like, is the benefit of the estrogen therapy, is it congruent with this other whole root cause thing going on with mold here? Because it might be one of those situations where we actually need to do some antifungal work and mold detox, stabilize inflammation in the immune system to then make the body capable of receiving the exogenous hormone more effectively. So it's always kind of a context matters and when is it the appropriate time for which therapeutic strategy.
Yeah, totally. I'm actually going to present on that in our Hormone Zoomer launch webinar next week. So,
There we go. Tune in for that.
um, next question also from Jan. I understand probiotics are good, but don't some probiotics feed mold? And how do we know which ones to avoid?
That's a good question. I can't say I can think of any way that probiotics are really feeding mold. A lot of different probiotics, such as Bacillus subtilis, HU58, which is a great spore biotic, releases a lot of different bacteriocins and antimicrobial peptides. So it can have sort of an antimicrobial probiotic effect. And then, like I said, not only some of the bacillus probiotics, but also lactobacillus and bifido can also help to bind, neutralize, and metabolize some of the mycotoxins within the intestinal lumen so that they're not leaking into the body and driving more of a systemic mycotoxicosis response. So I personally can't think of any way that using quality probiotic strains would be really hurtful for mold illness. I'm of the mindset I think they're very powerful therapeutic strategies for mold illness. So I'm very pro probiotic therapy in these cases.
Fantastic. So Danielle says that kind of a question. Do you find that mast cell activation in men tends to be a bit more hidden? Because in women, it tends to be very prominent, but in men, seems to be a bit more stealthy with mold exposure. Maybe not outright full histamine symptoms, but maybe neuroinflammation's happening. Any response to that?
Yeah, I would say there's a lot going on there, both psychologically and physiologically. I think for one thing, women are much more health conscious and open and usually more in tune with their body and their biofeedback and sort of bodily signals and whatnot. Men, not always, this is just sort of a gross generalization, but men tend to be a little bit more repressed, not as in tune with their body, maybe not either recognizing or admitting some of the symptoms that they might be having. So sometimes when I'm consulting with women, they might report all of these symptoms. And sometimes their lab work might look better than you would have thought based on the symptoms that they reported. Whereas men, it can sometimes be the other way around, where it's like they don't really report a whole lot of symptoms clinically, but then you look at their blood work and they, might have raging histamine or inflammation. But let's also keep in mind that because testosterone is such a potent mast cell stabilizer and men have on average way more testosterone, this is part of why I think it's 80% of all autoimmune cases are in women. There's this whole estrogen theory around autoimmunity. So I do think women are going to be a little bit more susceptible to histamine issues and MCAS issues because of the hormonal dynamics at play.
That's right. A cycling female's much more complicated.
Yep, absolutely.
Switching gears a little bit, if someone had a Wilson blot and is positive to Borrelia and still having issues, is it a good idea to get the full tick-borne 2.0 with the co-infections and all the other infections that could be beyond Borrelia?
I would say yes. I always use the tick-borne 2.0, but sometimes my clients might bring Western blot from their conventional integrative person that they might be working with. And it's a good, preliminary screen, but I really want the full serology and PCR, not just for Borrelia, but all of the other potential co-infections. The tick-borne 2.0 is so extensive and expansive, right? So, I want to get an idea of, okay, obviously, is it more latent? Is it more historical exposure with IgG? Is it, maybe reactivated, potentially like E reactivation? Yeah, and what's the PCR doing? So I would say if you have a positive Western blot, it still might be worth doing the full tick-borne 2.0 to get a more expansive view of stealth infection activity.
Yeah, totally. If you suspect anything, you want to know what's there because they're all treated
Mhm.
differently.
Yeah, exactly.
So on a related note, you had a slide with all of these lab tests and people were commenting like, how could you possibly order all these, especially for some chronic illness patients where, they have lots of financial issues. So if you had to prioritize,
Mhm.
which ones would be your top like 1, 2, or 3?
Yeah. Yeah. Honestly, I'm glad somebody asked because my practice is very much a concierge practice where we literally are customizing their service like down to the dollar. I believe that if we really want to help our clients and patients to the best of our ability, we need to ensure that their financial resources are going as far as possible. So I don't want to break the piggy bank on data. I want to make sure that we're taking action. Right. And I think sometimes in the world of functional medicine, we maybe lose sight of we can help people a lot with no testing. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't want to feel like I'm empirically stumbling around in the dark. I want as much hard data as I can really get. But I do really empathize with this because a lot of my clients, they can't afford all of the things, they might be able to afford $500 of blood work might be the best that we can do. So we're going to make the most of which biomarkers that are going to give us the kind of the broadest net, if you will. So in my practice, we actually recommend starting with just a base blood panel that's like $150, right? Most people can afford $150 blood work. And then there's a layering to that, right? Because if we see a lot of disturbances in their basic blood work and we want or need to dig deeper, can prioritize that next test. Because I recognize all those panels I listed out could easily be like $3,000-4,000 worth of testing. But I'm very, very selective of based on the clinical presentation, what objective data do we have, what's going to be the priority. For example, I would prioritize an organic acids test over a mycotoxin test a lot of times because I feel like I get more physiological insight and context as opposed to just toxin excretion. As one example, or even the gut zoomer can be a great, bang for your buck. So it totally depends on their symptoms, their presentation, and we'll suss that out as far as what the testing priorities really are.
Yeah, starting with the basic, the foundational, and then going into the specialty things based on what you see in the first testing.
Yeah, absolutely.
On a related note, case case question here: if someone has elevated MMP9 in their blood and a collection of inflammatory like symptoms that have not been figured out or traced back to anything yet, where would you look next? Is the mold the first thing that comes to your mind? Like, what would your testing recommendation be here?
It's a good question. With the MMP9, which I think is a really interesting marker, very much reflective of angiogenesis and blood vessel formation. So, for example, you will see it elevated in athletes that are more active because they have more blood vessel formation, more angiogenesis. But it's also implicated as part of the inflammatory response. We can break down the extracellular matrix. So, what I like about this question is it's taking a biomarker that's not necessarily good or bad. It's just a physiological indicator of extracellular matrix degradation. But then within the context of inflammatory like symptoms and the joint pain and all of that, that is pretty suspicious. So with that MMP9, I'd really want their alpha MSH. I'd want basic blood work. I'd want like maybe not all the exotic markers that I mapped out there, but definitely like mold and stealth infections is what comes to mind first. So we can use various clinical biomarkers that I included on one of those slides to suss that out. And then that really helps me determine, okay, which functional test do I want to explore the root cause of, right? Because there's assessing physiology and then there's assessing root cause factors. And those are kind of separate things. So first I have to get a grip on what's going on physiologically and then consider what root cause factors are playing into that physiological dysregulation. But I definitely, this type of question is sort of posing this kind of SIRS, mold, self-infection type picture. So I would be looking at, tick-borne 2.0, total tox, organic acids, gut zoomer to kind of get things going, to say the least.
Great. Thank you for that. Question about supplementation. What brand of serum bovine immunoglobulins do you like and use to see success for detox?
Yeah. So immunolin is the raw ingredient. And I think there's a lot of products on the market now. Mega IgG 2000 from Microbiome Labs was the first one I started using, and I still use it to this day. I private label immunolin as well with my own little supplement line. So immunolin is what you're looking for, but as long as it's an immunolin containing product, that's what I would recommend. And with that, I didn't really get into the dosages, but to put it in perspective, the original medical food, Interrogam, which was the original medical food of immunolin, that's dosed as high as like 30 grams daily. Whereas like if you get, a bottle of immunolin powder, one serving is like a scoop and that's like 2 grams. So I like to often megadose that. I'll start them at like 1 scoop twice daily, and then I'll crank that up to, as high as like 10 scoops, daily or even more at times if they're handling it well.
All right. Question about MRI. If you use the NQ MRI for monitoring progress, how would you interpret 1 year post-treatment residual but improved inflammation in certain parts of the brain?
So looking at this question here, I don't use MRI or scans. I use neurofilament light chain and glial fibrillary acidic protein in the blood combined with the neural zoomer. Because essentially what I'm doing there is using the neural zoomer to look at the serology towards various proteins within the brain as reflective of a neuroautoimmune process, which is obviously going to be exacerbated by a more leaky brain and excess neuroimmunological activity. Whereas then the neurofilament light chain is sort of a direct quantitative load of the damage being done to the neurons. And then glial fibrillary acidic protein is really kind of a direct marker of astrocyte activation, neuroinflammation. So between those two markers with the neural zoomer, that is what I'm using to track progress neurologically, not using any scans in my practice.
Great. Thanks for addressing that. Someone wants to know about fiber intake. Can that help with mold detox? Do we know any mycotoxins that bind well to fiber for elimination?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, apple pectin and konjac fiber and psyllium husk, fiber in general is going to help bind and neutralize a lot of different things, including mycotoxins. So, certainly when we think about fiber and all the critical roles it plays in human health, especially when we're talking about saccharolytic fermentation and short chain fatty acid production, because that butyrate in particular is such an amazing immunological switch that's going to be very anti-inflammatory and help the melanocytes heal and fuel mitochondria. And the butyrate, I didn't get into it because it's not really a gut-brain axis presentation. But when we think about microglial activation, lipopolysaccharide activates that pro-inflammatory phenotype. The butyrate switches it to the anti-inflammatory phenotype. So if we can decrease the endotoxin burden, such as using the serum bovine immunoglobulins to neutralize those, and use fiber and prebiotics, probiotics, oligosaccharides to boost butyrate production, that can be a really powerful way to modulate the neuroinflammatory storm.
Thank you for that. I think this one may be related. Louise wants to know, what then would you say about acromantia contributing to mucus and giving more places for microbes to hide or flourish?
Yeah, acromantia has been such a hot subject lately, hasn't it? Which is rightfully so. It's a major keystone species, lives within the mucosal barrier and helps to recycle, regenerate our mucous membrane. So absolutely critical, and we can get some insight into endogenous acromantia population with stool testing, of course. And then these days, because acromantia supplementation is, trending a lot right now, there's always the question of, do I supplement with acromantia and what's that going to do for me? Now, we can approach that kind of like butyrate. It's the same thing. We can supplement with exogenous butyrate. We can supplement with exogenous, either live or pasteurized heat killed acromantia. I've seen some research that implies the pasteurized is just as effective, if not maybe more effective than the live acromantia. But also we have to keep in mind, I think what we really want is to boost our endogenous acromantia population within the gut. So this is where using, again, prebiotics and fibers and sporobiotics and, creating a terrain and an environment that allows that acromantia to really thrive. So that way you don't have to just rely on an exogenous supplement. But I'm the type of guy, like whatever gets the job done, whatever works, whatever resonates with clients. So if they want to supplement with butyrate and acromantia exogenously until we kind of get their microbiota a little bit more diverse and back online, that's totally fine. But I'm all for using acromantia supplementation, but also make sure let's boost the endogenous population as well through good, microbiome landscaping, if you will.
Yeah, it really comes down to the terrain in a lot of these cases.
Absolutely.
I would like you to share the name of your course again. So we're going to bring that back up on the screen if you want to click back
Sure.
one. There we
Yeah, so I
go.
created the Functional Mental Health Practitioner Certificate Program, or FMHP. So this is where I teach the methodology that I developed here with this integrative neurosystems matrix is essentially the methodology. FMHP is the credential. So I train practitioners and all this stuff, and going to keep pioneering this work. So you can scan that QR code if you want to learn a little bit more about it.
And then relatedly, do you take new patients for Zoom appointments from out of state?
Yeah. So if anybody wants to submit an inquiry to learn more about what we do, because it's kind of like three businesses in one. We have the private practice where we interface with clients all over the country. We don't do a ton international, just time zones, lab restrictions makes it a little bit harder. So we do like a little bit of consulting, but mostly stateside. And then we've got the Institute, which is what the FMHP program is. And then we have the Research Foundations. We have a a research and education branch, not for profit, the institute, and then the practice. But if you want to learn more about any of it, you can just email info@metabolicsolutions.llc.com, and my team will make sure to give you all the information that you want.
You got some nice kudos from Suzette,
Amazing. Thank you.
along with, where's the other one? Can't find it. Someone else was saying, yes, we love this. You should go to the Integrative Health Symposium in New York. One final question here before we close. If tick-borne 2.0 is negative for the CDC's criteria, but IgG is positive for the alternate Lyme criteria, is this a situation where you would say yes, Lyme and treat, or where do you feel on that?
That's a good question. There's kind of a lot of layers to it because, in the world of functional medicine, what makes us different is we don't always do like the point and shoot allopathic monotherapy, right? So it's not like, okay, based on CDC criteria, you're positive, here's the doxycycline with nothing else, see you in a little bit, right? As holistic functional integrative, we're a lot of times working around the edges. We're working on all the systems holistically to improve their overall health. So for example, the way that I would pose this, like let's say CDC criteria is negative, IgG might be, it kind of depends how high. Like if it's really, really high, that's a little bit more suspicious than just like kind of high. But also, I really have to corroborate the serology and antibodies with some of the comprehensive clinical biomarkers to quantify their immune status, their inflammatory status, organ function. Because if I do see more inflammation, more immune activation or dysregulation, or even exhaustion, with, more substantially elevated IgG towards whether it's Borrelia or something else, I'm going to be a little bit more inclined to obviously do some terrain theory work with the microbiota and trying to build up the immune system. But also, yeah, maybe some more targeted antimicrobial work. Like I might, kind of flush their system with a little bit of liposomal biocidin or something just to take a more prophylactic broad spectrum approach for any naughty microbes and self-infections that might be there, but we might not have the super loud indices of. So it just really depends on the clinical context.
Okay, thanks for that. And it was John who recommends you talk at IHS, and he knows the person who organizes those lectures. So if you're interested, there's a connection waiting to happen. Otherwise, just
I
more gra-
usually go to IHS.
otherwise, just more gratitude. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to tell us about this important topic and for staying after answer all these audience questions. Again, everyone, you will get a copy of this recording and the slides. And that is in terms for questions. So with that, thank you everyone for joining. Hope you learned something helpful and have a vibrant rest of your day. Take care, everyone.